Well, I, I wish to ask you, what do you think of the idea of fraternity proposed by the message of Pope Francis? Because you put the question, the fundamentalists are not thoroughly wrong in the sense that they want a society that is permeated by their religious spirit. They refuse to be confined in a private domain. What is the error of fundamentalists? They think, after all, that there is only the state and the absolutely private domain of reality. They exclude the domain of fraternity, of the self-organization of communities. And isn't it, on the contrary, that we should stress that we want a religious society as much as they do? We do not want a society that is empty, that is void, in which the open space, the public square, to remember my friend Richard John Newhouse, in which the open square is left empty. We want a public square that is full of religious signs, of the significance of the presence of religious communities, because we think it is the only way to make it more humane. But this cannot be the state. This cannot be the result of violence. This cannot be even the result of a kind of proselytism, in the sense in which Pope Francis spoke against proselytism. It is the result of witness. The witness given by a kind of life that is so human that other people feel attracted to it. Isn't it perhaps a key that will start also a dialogue with fundamentalists?
I mean, first thing is, if you go back, I mean, there's a section in Thomas Aquinas' Treatise on Faith. Oh, yeah. Section in Aquinas' Treatise on Faith, where there's a whole discussion about should Christians be on familiar grounds with non-believers? Should they have intercourse, in the sense of, friendly interaction with non-believers? He's kind of skeptical to it. Yes, under some circumstances, you got to be really careful. Should the rights of non-believers be tolerated? Notice the word tolerated, because that's another question that he asks. And Aquinas was rather on the progressive spectrum. There were other thinkers like Hostiensis, this canonist, who thought that the lands of that dominion came with faith in God. So the lands of non-believers could just be expropriated. They didn't have true dominion. All right, so there's a whole range of views. But the way to work out of this is to take principles like give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, give unto God the things that are of God. Outside of the church, there is no salvation. That's a hard one. And to understand how these principles, without rejecting them, can be understood in somewhat different ways, more flexible ways that apply. And that's what Catholic theologians have done. Most of the sort of, don't reject that principle outside of the church, no salvation. All right, so the Muslims have a similar set of issues running. They've got the domain of peace and the domain of war. All right, the domain of peace for the really hardcore Muslims is the Muslim community and those who are faithful to the rules of Islam and those who recognize their subordination to it. People of the book. But then there are a whole set of other Muslims who are trying, just like no salvation outside. They try to broaden and reinterpret their traditional principles. So I think that's the way to go. So again, and we have, actually in the West, we have very unnuanced understandings of what's going on. So we've got these big categories like Salafis, or we say, or Wahhabis, and we say that, oh God, all this horrible ISIS stuff, it's all it's all based on the, Wahhabism. But that's not correct, because you've got quietist Wahhabis, there are a range of views. But the main thing is, people need to work with a discourse that's recognizably religious, if you're dealing with people who you might put under the label of fundamentalist. But I think that can be done because we've done it in our own tradition. So that's the well, maybe not a short answer. Yeah.
No, congratulations for your very nice text. And I go to the last part that is very important today, I think,
Yeah.
and very interesting. Of course, there are two kingdoms. This is Thomas Aquinas, and this is the new also of the Christian religion, because the other religion are especially for the Muslim. But you know, Maritain was very criticized to be in Humanismo Integral, to be completely liberal, because he put the individual for something, the person for that, and there are no connections. And this is one thing.
Say no connection between?
Because the individual is for the state and the person for the church, and a person don't have any connection in the end. This was the critique. But Maritain after change. But the Pope Francis say, just here, that because Paul VI say that the politics is the form pure high of the charity, the church need to do to make politics in the sense to defend the justice. And I think that the Beatitudes, that is more or less the program of Pope Francis, are for all religions, and is really a common commitment that could have the different religions. In fact, the different religions maybe cannot pray in the same altar, but can defend the human dignity, the justice, the peace, and this is a common thing that they can do together. And I think this is really very important today in the globalized world, that the religion has influence, the real influence in the some critic and some vision critic from the state, because the state many times have egoistic interests that not have enough sufficient critic from the same state.
I mean, I like what you're saying. I just recognize there are sort of two extremes we need to move between. One extreme, and it goes back to the previous point, would be, why would a fundamentalist want to be very restrictive about fraternity? Well, if I'd put the argument in Catholic terms, it would be, there's no charity without faith, right? And so the people with whom we should be in the circle of charity most of all are ones with whom we share faith. So then everyone else is going to be on a somewhat more, reduced level of in the hierarchy of charity. So that would be one extreme where you get pushed in the fundamentalist direction. The other extreme would be to take certain important central religious statements like the Beatitudes, and to then start thinking of them in a purely terrestrial kind of frame. Because the Beatitudes, it's a lot about what the kingdom of heaven is and how we prepare ourselves for it. And it's a sort of a beginning of how to get there. So that the...
No, the Beneventuranzas se refer...
No, they're reflected here. But what I want to say is the meaning is not reducible to what we're the sort of actions that we're doing here. It's all about this other preparation. So what I like about Martin's approach is he's trying to preserve those two levels with this idea that these core truths like the Beatitudes can be generative of temporal truths that we can share with others, that are not exclusive. So you get a religious argumentation that's not exclusivist, and that can meet other religious argumentations, ideally.
Professor Plenary.
Thank you. I think we have very well defined principles of democracy and human rights regarding religious freedom. We have secular, politics is secular also in the Catholic tradition. There is natural law, religion, Catholicism is or Christianity is the logos religion, as Pope Benedict wrote as Cardinal Ratzinger. So there is the whole natural law tradition, could say Aristotle, Thomas, and politics where one argues from logos, from reason. And then there is religious freedom, which is a modern way of putting tolerance or acceptance of dissenters. In Norwegian law, it was called a law on dissenters when Catholics were readmitted to the country in 1864. Now it is religious freedom, which has been defined very well by the court in Strasbourg. Joseph Weiler chaired the case for Italy, as you remember, in this case about the crucifixes. And the final interpretation, I think, is quite correct, that minorities must be allowed to exercise their religion. And this is the standard understanding of religious freedom. And then the third principle is universal citizenship, or non-differentiated citizenship. And there we have evolved historically from discriminatory citizenship based on wealth. Only the rich could become citizens. Only men could become citizens, not women, not workers, to universal citizenship. And these are key principles of all democracy today. So I think this is there's a set of rules regarding these three aspects that are quite clearly established in international law, as well as in the understanding of what they should entail. The problem today is the one that the Pope faces in Egypt, namely that he cannot say, we expect full recognition, non-discrimination of Christians. They have religious freedom, they must enjoy religious freedom, they must have full rights, they must not feel that they are discriminated again in any way. Well, that's very far from the reality in very many countries. One could say, perhaps on the positive note, that this evolution of thought politically, but also within the church, our church, has gone from a very sort of fundamentalist understanding of church and state to this modern version of rights. John the 23rd was the one who embraced human rights explicitly. And so this is possible, hopefully, also for Islam, although we have, as Christians, this doctrinal separation of politics, give unto Caesar, and give unto God. But despite that, I do hope that Islam can evolve, because this is the only way forward. Yes, I'm saying we have resolved these issues in modern democracy and in our religion. The problem today is Islam, basically, which has not resolved this. If you want to comment on that.
Let's do one thing. I think Bishop Minareth had a question or comment, and then I'll let Professor Reichberg address both Janas and Bishop, because I think it's very, very important points.
In your last remarks, you quoted the period in which the church claimed for jurisdiction over the temporal order, but you did not mention Vatican II, which really was the moment in which the Catholic Church rethought the whole question of relationship to the temporal order, and by coming back to the origin, and this is important. And we discovered, and it has to be repeated today, that it was Christianity in the history of humanity which for the first time made a distinction between belonging to a religious community and belonging to a state as citizens. And this is the key principle which allowed the developments which we have today. I do not think that other religious traditions can incorporate this principle, because they are built on other subjects, on other elements. And so it is very difficult to say, now, okay, they are going to make like us, so they will be nice. And no, the roots, I think, of Islam is that the Ummah, the community, is intrinsically a political and religious community. And you cannot tolerate people who have another faith inside Ummah. And so this is the key to interpret what is happening today.
Question is a brief response, and then this sounds like a great topic for discussion at our coffee break. So a little brief response, and then we'll continue this conversation.
Yeah, you know, the fact is that the distinction between the spiritual and the temporal, for many centuries that did not, that for it to have the implication that's pointed to today, took at least maybe 18 centuries. And if you look over the wide scope of the Middle Ages, the whole temporal order was inherently infused with principles from the faith. And so you had a situation almost identical to what you have in Islam today. You had if you were living in the Kingdom of France and you were a Muslim or Jew, you would be just as you would be on the outside of that full participation in that society. So the point that Jana Matlari mentioned about natural law, you know, in these debates there are really two different problems. One is identifying the truth, the other is being motivated to act in accordance with it. And religion comes into play most importantly, I think, on the level of motivation. I don't think anyone would be motivated to act directly on the basis of a natural law appeal. That's why I think we need to engage in a more explicitly religious argumentation to get at some of these problems with people who view themselves as religiously committed. The bit about Vatican II, the one text that I've looked at closely in this regard is Dignitatis Humanae, and it actually does not rule out the idea of a confessional state. There's a passage in the text where it seems to say that none of what's said here prejudices, you know, the special obligations of Christians, of Catholics living in a majority Catholic state. So I don't know whether this issue of democracy in places where Catholics are the majority, I don't know whether that's been clearly drawn out in the magisterial texts.